Hello, everybody. So this would be week 6, day 12. And today I'm going to be talking about the end of Nazi Germany and VE Day, which is Victory in Europe Day, which we just celebrated back on May 8th. And then closing in on Japan. And how we get to the point where it's time to decide about the invasion of Japan and how that will all go down. All right, so first of all, let's end things in Europe. The city of Berlin is at this point surrounded by the Russians. Groups of Germans are fighting their way through the Russians to break out of the city, to fight their way to the west so they can surrender to the Americans or to the British. Some are successful, many are not. Whole groups. Some of the largest losses of the Germans during World War II are in and around the city of Berlin in their attempts to break out. And as the German army in its last death throes tries to defend the city of Berlin, to no effect. And then as it's obvious that Berlin itself is surrounded and they won't be able to break in and get them out, the German army begins to kind of come apart and fade to the west, to migrate to the west to the Americans and turn themselves in. Hitler celebrates his birthday on April 20th. He's already made the decision in his head that if they lose the war, it's because the German people don't deserve to win. He starts making these irrational speeches and things on the radio. Also, his last time being photographed or being seen in movie footage is about this time. I'll attach the video. He's pinning the Iron Cross onto a bunch of Hitler Youth kids as young as 12, 15 years old for valor in destroying Russian tanks on the front lines and acting as messengers and runners in the last couple of weeks. He declares a fight to the death, and a few days later, he marries his longtime fiancée, Eva Braun, and she becomes Mrs. Hitler, but only for a day or two. They decide that they're going to commit suicide, and they have both poison and pistols to do that. Hitler tests the poison on his German Shepherd, Blondie is the dog's name, to make sure the poison actually works, and it does. And soldiers on guard in the bunker below the streets of Berlin hear a gunshot. They come in and they can see that Eva has taken poison and died, and then Adolf has taken poison and then shot himself at the same time. So they drag the bodies out of the bunker and into a ditch nearby, and they pour probably the last can of gasoline in Berlin onto the bodies and light them on fire so that they will not be recognized by the Russians, so the bodies won't be desecrated. Well, it doesn't work. The Russians move in, they capture everything. And that's kind of, they mention the fact to the Americans and the British that, oh yeah, we found Hitler's body and Eva Braun's body, and Joseph Goebbels and his family all commit suicide. Mrs. Goebbels poisons all the kids, and then they commit suicide. It's really messed up. It's just like the key leaders of the German government all kind of just, implode one after another. Anyway, but several key leaders attempt to escape. Hermann Goering attempts to escape and is captured, and he'll go on trial. And somehow manages to keep a poison capsule with him and evade capture of the poison capsule long enough that when they finally do sentence him to death, he commits suicide in prison, so they can't hang him. Anyway, with the death of Hitler and Mrs. Hitler, the war effectively comes to an end. Command goes to a guy by the name of Karl Dönitz, admiral of the Reichsnavy, and his only job is to organize the surrender of Germany. There is no fighting onward. It all comes crashing down around them. Fighting ceases along the boundary between the Americans, the British, and the Russian forces. Fighting ceases generally. And there are just masses of German prisoners who all need to be rounded up and kept in fields, basically, until they can be accounted for and determinations can be made about whether these people are guilty of any war crimes, and then they can be paroled and sent home. Admiral Dönitz surrenders, technically causing Victory in Europe Day to be May 8th, although it is interesting that there's a surrender to the Russians and then there's a surrender to the Allies. The Germans really wanted to surrender to the Americans, the British. They did not want to have to surrender to the Russians in any way, shape, or form. General von Rundstedt ends up being the guy who surrenders to the, in a different surrender ceremony to the Americans. I'll see if I can find a short blip on that. And so the war comes to an end. Victory is celebrated all over Western Europe and in the United States. But looming on the horizon is the fact that Japan has yet to be dealt with. For the Americans fighting on an island called Okinawa, May 8th is just another day. Like, hey, the Germans surrendered. Yeah, who cares? Also, and I mentioned this last week, in April, we lose FDR on April 12th. So it's only 8 days later that Hitler has his birthday, and just a few days after that he's dead. And so both of these key leaders are out of the picture fairly quickly. Truman is president now. By the time the Germans surrender, Truman is president, and Truman's got decisions to make about the Pacific. The closing in on Japan, the island hopping focuses now on two specific island groups, the Jima Islands, the Iwo Jima and Chichijima, specifically Iwo Jima, because it's halfway to Japan from Tinian and Saipan, where the big bomber bases are. And the Americans are now bombing every major city in Japan, one after another, until it destroyed them all. They will conduct a nighttime raid of Tokyo, but will cause such a firestorm that it will basically cause a fire tornado over the city of Tokyo. More people will die in the firebombing of Tokyo on that night, I don't remember what night it is, than will actually die when the Nagasaki bomb goes off. And not both atomic bombs together, but certainly singly. The Tokyo firebomb raid was actually worse. Now the difference, of course, is hundreds and hundreds of American bombers dropping hundreds and hundreds of incendiary bombs all over the city versus one plane and one bomb for Hiroshima. So the landings take place on February 19th, 1945 at Iwo Jima. They want to capture this island for two reasons. One, they can put American fighter planes on it, and then those American fighter planes can escort the bombers all the way to Japan and all the way back, so we'll lose less bombers. Second, they need an emergency runway halfway back to the bases in case a bomber gets damaged. It has a chance to land someplace and save the crew about halfway back. So Iwo Jima kind of becomes a life preserver to the bomber stream. But it's certainly not a life preserver to the Marines who land there. There's something like 33 days of combat on Iwo Jima after they predicted it would take a week. It ends up taking 33 days. The Japanese had honeycombed everything all over the island and made tunnels everywhere. And the Americans, Marines had to go through pretty much yard by yard. John Basilone, the Medal of Honor winner who we learned about earlier in the class, is killed at Iwo Jima. And also the raising of the American flag at Iwo Jima is photographed. There's actually two, the small flag and the big flag. And it's the picture of the big flag being raised that becomes the iconic symbol of the 7th War Drive and also of the war, and becomes the symbol of the Marine Corps. If you've been to the cemetery down in Washington, D.C., that's the big statue that's there, and all the Marines there are larger than life. The movie Flags of Our Fathers is specifically about that. Anyway, on April 1st, they then move on to Okinawa. They invade the island of Okinawa on April Fool's Day, ironically enough. The Japanese let them land. And then two things happen. They attack the American forces once they have been firmly entrenched on the island, so the Americans aren't going to get them off. And then they attacked from Japan with the weapon I've talked about before, the kamikaze. Kamikazes were particularly bad in the battle off Okinawa. The strategic bombing of Japan never ends through all of this, and as I said, pretty much every major city is reduced to cinders, suffers heavily. Japan prepares for invasion with thousands and thousands of kamikazes, and also crazy things like submarines with torpedoes with steering wheels on them. They'll have teenage boys riding a torpedo to their death by torpedoing a ship. That's the homing device. And then President Truman has to think about all of this as he's putting together his plan for it's called Operation Downfall and Operation Cornet. And together, this makes up the invasion of the islands of Japan itself. The American Marine Corps does not want to invade Japan. They've seen way too much trauma, and they've seen the Japanese fight to the death on Okinawa, so they certainly don't want it. So next week, we'll pick up with how they go ahead with the plan for the bomb, and why they go ahead for the plan with the bomb, and how the war wraps up with the Potsdam Conference and the surrender of the Japanese next week. So for all you seniors out there, have a wonderful, wonderful summer, and stay in touch.